Custodiet ipsos custodius. Who will guard the guards? Who will watch the watchmen? If any single phrase captures the challenge of surveillance in a democratic state, it's this language from the Roman satirist Juvenal. How do we make sure that those who are responsible for keeping us safe are not a threat to the citizens of the very union they are bound to protect? In East Germany, the Stasi internal security apparatus saw itself as both, quote, sword and shield of the party, and advanced the Communist Party's interests over those of individual citizens. What can a liberal Western nation do to prevent that sort of repression from occurring? America faced that very question in a significant way during the early 1970s. At the time, the U.S. government was discovered to have engaged in illegal and often immoral surveillance activities. Scrutiny focused on the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Formerly secret government initiatives with names like COINTELPRO, which was an FBI counterintelligence program to spy on communists in the United States, and later on the Ku Klux Klan and the Black Panther Party, along with MKUltra, which was a CIA initiative to research mind control and chemical weapons. These became hotly debated household terms. As the revelations grew, public concern became acute. So much so that Congress and the executive branch each undertook extensive reviews. In the end, we had an answer to Juvenal's question of who will guard the guards, and the entire structure of federal covert operations was transformed. This lecture is the story of that transformation. It was a true revolution in citizen oversight of national security activities. Democracy was strong enough and sufficiently supple to restrain Stasi-like influences in the United States, though not without some broken china. The Senate Church Committee, formerly known as the Select Committee to Study Governmental Operations with respect to intelligence activities, proved the strength and flexibility of American ideology. Though some today think we did not go far enough, the response of democracy in the 1970s is, in my view, a strong counterexample to the Stasi state. Confronted with abuse, we reinvigorated the power of those who watched the watchers, our congressional intelligence committees, inspectors general, and a new institution called the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. This demonstration of democratic oversight of secret governmental functions was, I suggest, a successful application of American values. Let's begin by casting our mind back to the 1950s, in the immediate aftermath of World War II. Americans of that era were afraid of communism and vigorously defended themselves against the slightest hint of it. Today, we rightly look back with a mixture of shame and disdain at one of the most virulent forms of that pursuit, the anti-communist rantings of Senator Joseph McCarthy and the mole-hunting inquiries of the House Un-American Activities Committee, which was known as HUAC. But the excess of people like the late Wisconsin Senator McCarthy are often mistaken for the underlying motivation of all who serve in government. And that's plainly incorrect. One recurring theme we see over time is the idea that most, though certainly not all, individuals who work within the U.S. intelligence community are motivated by a heartfelt concern for national security. Indeed, without in any way, manner, shape, or form defending McCarthyite excess, it's useful to understand what was driving the CIA, the NSA, and the FBI during the 1950s and 60s. The world had just seen the Soviet coup in Czechoslovakia in 1948, the fall of China to Mao Zedong in 1949, the Korean War beginning in 1950, and of course, the Soviet Union's successful detonation of an atomic bomb, largely on the back of its own espionage operation. Meanwhile, the United States and the Soviet Union had failed to reach a post-war settlement that would allow for amiable coexistence. Most American policymakers, including Presidents Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy, all saw the Soviet Union as intent upon controlling as much of the world as it could. And in the late 1940s and early 1950s, a series of espionage incidents seemed to confirm this view. One of the earliest was the discovery in 1945 of thousands of classified government documents in the offices of Amerasia, a magazine with ties to the Communist Party of the United States of America. The era also saw the investigation into whether a former top U.S. diplomat, Alger Hiss, was secretly a communist, as well as the prosecution of a U.S. Department of Justice official named Judith Kaplan, who was allegedly a KGB spy, and, of course, the still historically controversial arrest and execution of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg after their convictions of conspiring to spy for the Soviet Union. Now, none of this excuses the unwarranted and often illegal activities undertaken by the intelligence community in its anti-communist fervor. With the benefit of 20/20 hindsight, we can see this historical vision as hysteria motivated by fear. And perhaps from that, we can learn some lessons for today. But calling it unreasoning hysteria does not lessen the urgency with which the fear was felt. So, with that background in mind, let's now examine some of the abuses and excesses of the American intelligence and law enforcement communities in the years leading up to the mid-1970s. The issues first started coming to light in the early 1970s through investigative reporting that revealed illegal activities involving the American intelligence community. For example, in 1970, Christopher Pyle, a former Army captain, disclosed a domestic spying program that was conducted by the Army itself. The folksy North Carolina Senator Sam Ervin, who later in his career became famous for chairing the Senate Watergate investigation, was among the leaders of the early Senate probes into this reported Army spying on Americans. Then, in 1974, Seymour Hersh, an investigative reporter for the New York Times, published details of several CIA operations that over the years had come to be called the family jewels. Hersh exposed activities ranging from covert efforts to subvert foreign governments to intelligence activities within the United States aimed at political opponents of the executive branch. These revelations led to the House and Senate independently chartering two select committees for thoroughly examining how America's intelligence and law enforcement communities had conducted themselves. Long Island Congressman Otis Pike chaired the House committee. Idaho Senator Frank Church chaired the parallel committee in the Senate, hence its name, the Church Committee. In addition, in 1975, President Gerald Ford asked Vice President Nelson Rockefeller to lead an internal investigative review by the executive branch, an inquiry known as the Rockefeller Commission. Over the course of the next 2 years, these three panels worked at a frenetic pace. Here are some of the things we now know about surveillance in America during the 1950s and 60s. And this is just a representative sample. It's by no means comprehensive, and it doesn't even include many of the non-surveillance activities that were also uncovered. Beginning in the mid-1950s, for example, the CIA and the FBI ran a program known as HT Lingual, a program that continued in operation until 1973. HT Lingual operated as if it were a mail cover program. That is, a system by which the government records all of the information on the outside of an envelope or package. Typically, this involves recording, at a minimum, the name and address of the sender and of the recipient. Now, mail programs like this are almost certainly lawful and constitutional, and they've operated in the United States for more than 100 years. So that's not the story. But HT Lingual was different because it went beyond reviewing the outside of the mail envelopes. It also involved the illegal, illicit, and secret opening of mail without a warrant to read the contents of the letters inside the envelope. The CIA, under HT Lingual, illegally opened more than 215,000 pieces of mail. And of course, the CIA went to great lengths to keep its operations secret, even from the U.S. Postal Service. Mail was moved to a private room, or in some instances, opened at night, so that postal officials were unaware of the illegal CIA activity. Another significant CIA program was dubbed Operation Mockingbird. In broad strokes, this program involved efforts by the CIA to influence press coverage and plant propaganda through witting and unwitting journalists alike. It's said that at the height of the program, as many as 25 journalists participated with the CIA as cooperators. The first indications that such a program existed came out in the late 1960s. In March 1967, for example, a muckraking magazine known as Ramparts published a story titled NSA and the CIA, where, in this instance, the acronym NSA doesn't stand for the National Security Agency, but rather for the National Student Association. This was a nationwide organization of college students that later merged with the National Student Lobby and today is known as the United States Student Association. According to the former Ramparts editor Sol Stern, who was the principal author of the article, the CIA was funding the National Student Association and using it as a front organization for advancing the CIA's views on campuses across the country. Perhaps more to the point, the CIA's efforts to control propaganda over some of the American press allowed it to soft pedal or downplay unflattering stories about the CIA activities. Evan Thomas, in his book on the CIA titled The Very Best Men, said that by employing Mockingbird, the CIA was able to dissuade the New York Times from covering the 1954 overthrow of Guatemalan President Jacobo Arbenz Guzman, a coup that was the result of a covert CIA operation. Here's how the Church Committee summarized Operation Mockingbird in its 1976 report. Quote, "The CIA currently maintains a network of several hundred individuals around the world who provide intelligence to the CIA and at times attempt to influence opinion through the use of covert propaganda. These individuals provide the CIA with direct access to a large number of newspapers and periodicals, scores of press services and news agencies, radio and television stations, commercial book publishers, and other foreign media outlets." End quote. It was not until 1976 that newly appointed CIA Director George H.W. Bush, who, of course, later became president, announced that the CIA would never again have a contractual relationship with any news correspondent. Now, perhaps the most infamous program of the era was COINTELPRO, conducted by the FBI. Its purpose was to surveil, infiltrate, disrupt, and at times discredit domestic political organizations that were thought to be un-American. It operated in conjunction with an NSA program known as Minaret, which targeted the personal communications of civil rights leaders, anti-war activists, and the like. As an aside, one of the delightful or chilling ironies of this entire story is that among the subjects of surveillance under Project Minaret was none other than Senator Frank Church himself. COINTELPRO targeted various communist organizations, socialist organizations, organizations associated with civil rights movements, including those run by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and other black civil rights organizations. Also subject to COINTELPRO scrutiny were anti-war groups, including the Students for the Democratic Society and several other liberal organizations, like the National Lawyers Guild and members of the women's rights movement. A small portion of the scrutiny was directed at white hate groups, such as the Ku Klux Klan. The scrutiny of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was perhaps the most notorious or infamous COINTELPRO activity. William Sullivan, the agent in charge of COINTELPRO, wrote the following about King after his 1963 March on Washington. This is according to an account by the New York Times reporter Tim Weiner in his book, Enemies, A History of the FBI. Quote, "In light of King's powerful demagogic speech, we must mark him now, if we have not done so before, as the most dangerous Negro of the future in this nation from the standpoint of communism, the Negro, and national security." End quote. The attempts to pressure and discredit King grew so great that a large file of his sexual peccadillos was assembled. Shockingly, the FBI ended up sending him a note that invited King to commit suicide as a way of preventing his own exposure. It read in part, quote, "King, there's only one thing left for you to do. You know what it is. You are done. There is but one way out for you. Better take it before your filthy, abnormal, fraudulent self is bared to the nation." End quote. Talk about amoral and illegal. Nor, of course, was King the only individual target of COINTELPRO. A list of other people targeted for surveillance reads like a who's who of the American left in the 1960s. It included authors such as David Halberstam and Ernest Hemingway, and the actress Jean Seberg, who was on the list because of her financial support for the Black Panther Party, so on. Now, Congress, through its investigating committees, had the principal role in reforming the intelligence community. But our story would not be complete without a brief mention of the complementary role that the courts also played in these efforts. The leading case here is titled United States versus United States District Court, which is an odd name for a lawsuit. As a result, it's sometimes better known as the Keith case, after Judge Damon Keith, the federal district court judge who started the matter. Here's the story. Several leaders of the so-called White Panther Party, a white supremacist group, were charged with bombing a CIA office in Ann Arbor, Michigan in 1968. Their phones were wiretapped by order of the U.S. Attorney General John Mitchell, who served under President Richard Nixon. Mitchell said that no warrant was required to authorize the interception because the defendants posed a, quote, "clear and present danger to the structure or existence of the government." Judge Keith responded that the Attorney General's rationale was insufficient and ruled that warrantless interception and surveillance of domestic conversations was unconstitutional. When the case reached the Supreme Court, the justices agreed with Judge Keith, establishing a precedent for the idea that a warrant was needed before electronic surveillance commenced, even if the domestic surveillance were related to national security matters. As Justice Lewis Powell said in writing for the court, quote, "The price of lawful public dissent must not be a dread of subjection to an unchecked surveillance power." Justice Powell continued, quote, "Nor must the fear of unauthorized official eavesdropping deter vigorous citizen dissent and discussion of government action in private conversation. For private dissent, no less than open public discourse, is essential to our free society." End quote. Now, notably, at least for our telling, the court limited its holding to domestic surveillance and said that different rules might apply when the surveillance occurred outside of the United States or when it was directed at a foreign power or non-Americans. Now, there is little that can be said in support of these illegal domestic spying activities by our intelligence and law enforcement agencies. At the outset, perhaps those who instituted them thought they were doing so for valid reasons. But as the surveillance programs morphed, they became increasingly divergent, both from their original justifications and even from any practical reality. Any country whose government contemplates a plan to threaten to disclose a citizen's unwanted pregnancy, as the U.S. did to Jean Seberg, is one that neither represents nor defends the people it serves, and is dangerously out of touch with social norms and conventions. When all is said and done, there is a real value in the authoritative, constitutional, and reasoned reviews of the Church, Pike, and Rockefeller committees. Through their diligence, they exposed unlawful and unregulated intelligence and law enforcement activity. And the result, stricter oversight, was a triumph for democratic principles. These committees put in place a new system of oversight and control that continues largely intact to this day. It represents a meaningful effort by democratic institutions to exercise oversight and maintain intelligence and law enforcement activities within the bounds of law. So let's turn to these new structures of oversight and control that were put in place. Here are some of the highlights of the most significant developments. Let's first talk about congressional review. In the wake of their investigations, the Church and Pike committees took on the full-time job of exercising oversight of the intelligence community. Senate Resolution 400 in 1976 and House Resolution 658 in 1977 established two intelligence committees as permanent select committees that continue to function to this day. The two committees were seen as an essential component, reining in the unregulated intelligence community. As Senator Frank Church said in 1975, quote, "The National Security Agency's capability at any time could be turned around on the American people, and no American would have any privacy left. Such is the capability to monitor everything, telephone conversations, telegrams. It doesn't matter. There would be no place to hide. If a dictator ever took over, the NSA could enable it to impose total tyranny, and there would be no way to fight back." End quote. Congress saw its oversight function as a way of limiting and restraining that possibility. The House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, commonly called HPSI, currently has 22 members, and the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, or SISI, has 15. By law, Congress must now be kept fully informed of significant intelligence activities. Often this means providing notification of covert action to Congress in the form of notification to the intelligence committees. Sometimes that notice may be delayed until after a covert action has taken place. In other, particularly sensitive cases, presidents have interpreted the law as meaning that they only need to notify the so-called, quote, Gang of Eight, rather than the full membership of the Congressional Intelligence Committees. The Gang of Eight consists of the Senate and House majority and minority leaders and the chair and ranking members of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees. The two congressional committees have exercised some degree of control over the intelligence community, though many dispute how much control they really muster. Through the mechanism of congressional hearings, consideration of presidential nominations, and the authorization and appropriations process, the intelligence committees exercise day-to-day review of the intelligence function. Through congressional hearings, for example, the committees invite, and indeed in some instances compel, high-ranking members of the executive branch to appear to answer questions, thereby making the intelligence community more transparent and, we hope, more effective. Many top leaders of our intelligence and law enforcement agencies, including all of the senior leaders of the Department of Justice, the FBI, the Director of National Intelligence, and the head of the CIA, are subject to senatorial confirmation. That requirement has developed into a form of congressional oversight of surveillance activities. In recent years, for example, Congress has increasingly come to withhold confirmation until the executive branch provides it with additional information that relates to areas of congressional oversight and inquiry. Congress can also legislate limits on intelligence community activities through budgetary authorizations and appropriations. That is, through the carrot and stick of funding or declining to fund particular intelligence activities. In more extreme cases, such as the Senate review of torture allegations related to the CIA's conduct of the war on terror, full-scale investigations have been undertaken. That particular investigation went on for several years and had the effect of publicly exposing a large amount of information about otherwise covert activities relevant to the CIA's counterterrorism program. Meanwhile, Congress also sought to address a gap left by the Keith decision on unauthorized spying, namely the fact that foreign surveillance might not be subject to judicial review under the Constitution. To fix that problem, in 1978, Congress adopted the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA, which defines the procedures and processes for authorizing the physical and electronic surveillance of foreign powers and agents of foreign powers. Under FISA, the government was authorized to conduct surveillance relating to foreign intelligence matters that might also include surveillance of American civilians acting as agents of a foreign power if and only if court authorization was obtained first. And that authorization would be given only if the court found there was probable cause to believe that the target of the investigation was in fact a foreign power or an agent of a foreign power. In addition, if the target of the surveillance were a U.S. person, there also had to be probable cause to believe that the person's activities might involve espionage or other similar conduct in violation of the criminal statutes of the United States. The term U.S. person, by the way, is a term of law with a particular meaning. It's often used in discussing surveillance, and it means either a U.S. citizen or a legal permanent resident of the United States, that is, a green card holder. In almost all cases, surveillance rules for U.S. persons are different than those for non-U.S. persons, that is, foreigners or temporary residents of and visitors to the United States. Under U.S. law, far greater restrictions are imposed on the intelligence community when the subject of surveillance is a U.S. person. Indeed, in many cases, it's completely prohibited. By contrast, surveillance of foreigners is generally thought of as the core mission of our intelligence agencies. And in case you're wondering, here's one definition of probable cause. It's, quote, a reasonable amount of suspicion supported by circumstances sufficiently strong to justify a prudent and cautious person's belief that certain facts are probably true, end quote. At the same time, because matters under investigation would be highly classified, Congress chose to create a special court called the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, or FISC. Here, the government is able to present its evidence justifying surveillance in an ex parte manner. Ex parte is Latin for from a party, and it means a decision that a judge makes after hearing only one side of the case. The FISC proceedings are also conducted behind the veil of classification so that its decisions are typically not recorded or published for public consumption. Two things, I think, are notable about these new mechanisms. The first is that they're pretty unique globally. Almost everywhere else in the world, intelligence collection is exclusively the province of the executive. Here in the United States, we have a shared governance model. It's difficult to overemphasize how unusual that is, both compared to other governments around the world and even compared to our own history. In 1818, U.S. Congressman Henry Clay said that how the president ran his, quote, Secret Service was, quote, not a proper subject for inquiry in Congress. And as recently as 2002, the Foreign Intelligence Court of Review suggested that the president had an inherent constitutional power to conduct foreign surveillance, implying that congressional review might even be unconstitutional. So we're fortunate indeed to have the oversight system we have. It is distinctive and unique in the world. Second, these new systems of congressional review and judicial review take place in a delegated or semi-transparent manner. Covert activities that previously were not subject to review outside the executive branch are now subject to review behind closed doors by a subset of our elected congressional representatives and in a non-adversarial process before federal judges, all of whom we expect to pass upon the legality and propriety of the surveillance activities being undertaken. It bears emphasis that this is a sort of halfway house between the complete secrecy that characterized surveillance activities in the early Cold War era and the complete transparency that some see as preferable. So let me end this rather grim lecture on a lighter note that circles back to where we began. The quote from Juvenal, "Quis custodiet ipsos custodius?" Who will guard the guards? Who will watch the watchmen? One of the ironies of the discussion is that Juvenal was not writing about politics or governance. He was talking about how to keep a young woman chaste by setting guardians at her door and worrying that the guardians might themselves breach their promises to protect her chastity by taking advantage of her. But the concept of guardianship is older than Juvenal. It has its origins in an idea advanced by Socrates that to protect society, we should have a group of societal guardians. Plato's Republic proposed that the answer to the problem of guardian misconduct was the education of their souls. More recently, as we have seen, the notion of trusting our educated Platonic guardians no longer suffices. The result was the creation of a system of oversight and audit that we have been in the process of fine-tuning ever since the 1970s.